Chapter 5 Observance. The small feathery feline looked around, passing by each structure slowly. She scanned the entire area every step, looking down the alleys as she drew closer to the towering skyscrapers within the abandoned city. She slowed her pace once she heard commotion deep within one of the alleys. In the corner of her sight, as she passed the dark area, she saw two enormous black birds tearing apart an old corpse. She stared at their hairless heads and dark bodies, every detail of their long, pale beaks, ragged feathers, and ugly pink faces. All she could think of was the spider monkey and its piercing stare when she faced it in the caverns, with video and pictures. Neither pictures nor video were here right now, though. Radio's paws tightened as she backed away from the enormous vultures and quickly fled further towards the city. Every pounding step she took against the hard pavement was cold, so she knew the shard wasn't anywhere near this area. She sighed and slowed her pace, hoping that video and pictures were nearby. What was she going to do if she actually did find something that suggested the location of the shard? Radio's paws slowly drew her to the city. She shook her head and hoped one of her companions would find her soon. How did Video expect them to regroup when Pictures was the only one who knew the area? Radio quickened her pace again, hoping to see something familiar, and trying not to fume at the situation. Why was she suddenly this master navigator that was going to find her way back? Radio stopped when the air around her grew colder. That's when she saw the looming figure only a building's distance away from her. She narrowed her eyes to focus on the form and realized it was a canine, a wolf of sorts. What was something like that doing alone in the middle of the city? Radio blinked her eyes and rounded them when the wolf moved. Her spine chilled when the enormous canine's eyes glittered cyan as it stared directly at her. She took a step back, watching its lips curl into a snarl. Radio could only muster a whimper at the sight, realizing it was the same look that the rats had in the pit near Faith's village. The wolf had been altered by the jester. She heard the slight chime of something, and her gaze shot up to the building between her and the wolf. She locked eyes with the dressed primate itself. Its eyes gleamed the same bright blue color as the wolf's as it looked down upon her, shining as it controlled the wolf's actions. Radio could imagine it no other way as the canine moved forward, only when the mage's eyes glowed brighter. She shook her head at the mage, pleading with rounded eyes it wouldn't sick the animal upon her. What did the beast have to lose, though? The mage was far out of reach, and likely had no connection to the wolf. Radio and the mage seemed to ponder the question at the same time, and she watched as the dressed monkey slammed its hand down, making the wolf charge directly at Radio. She screamed, scrambling to catch herself from falling and to run, and whipped around. Her paws drummed against the street as she ran as quickly as she could away from the animal, closing her eyes in fear as she heard it coming closer. The heat of the canine's breath blew against her fur as it drew close, and then she heard a yelp of pain. She skidded to a halt when she saw Video slice her claws against the canine's wet nose, the blood splattering across the solid ground. Radio stared in awe at the large cat, who barely reached the wolf's chest as she hissed and spat at it, until Video turned to look at her.
Get out of here! Find Pictures!
Video yelled sharply, then leapt away from the wolf's snapping jaws just in time to slice her claws against the creature's muzzle. Radio glanced at the battle only for a moment longer before she bolted away, running towards where she had seen Pictures go when they had gone their separate ways. It wasn't until after the two were out of sight when Radio regretted leaving, hearing their barks and screams in battle.
I should have fought! How could I have left Video there?
Tears streamed down Radio's face as she passed the decrepit buildings and ran faster than she ever had before, hoping to find Pictures. She kept her eyes and ears alert, turning her head to listen to any noise or see anything she might miss, but then finally heard Picture's voice speaking just off the street.
Pictures! Pictures!
She called out and skidded to a halt, trying not to yell when her paws scraped against the cement as she did so. Pictures came out from an alley. His tail bristled when seeing her.
Radio? What's wrong? What happened?
Radio shook her head.
The jester's here. It sent an animal to attack Video. We have to help her, please!
Pictures looked bewildered and more suspicious than concerned, but quickly stammered.
Oh, of course. Let's go, now!
Radio frowned at him, then quickly turned back around, leading the Silver Tom to the scene as quickly as she could. She nearly bumped straight into Video, who was puffed out to be twice her size, with eyes rounder than Radio had ever seen them.
She hadn't realized Pictures came this way.
Radio saw it on the feline's face. She had probably meant to lure the wolf away from the group, but it was too late for that. Radio heard the canine approaching rapidly, the smell of blood flaring Radio's nostrils. She growled and leapt past the giant tabby to scratch the wolf across its nose, just as Video had when it rounded the corner. She growled in pain as she landed against the pavement with her scraped pads, but she had given enough time for Pictures and Video to recover their shock and dodge the canine's next attacks. As they recovered from their own leaps, Radio jumped at the wolf again and bit her teeth into the beast's side, ripping her claws against its stomach. She ducked down just in time to avoid the vicious jaws of the animal, attempting to clamp its fangs into her scruff. Pictures leapt at the canine's neck and drove his fangs through the thick fur and into the wolf's throat. Radio was amazed at the size difference of the tomcat and enormous canine that towered over even Video, but the smell of blood became nearly overwhelming as Pictures was successful with gripping the tender skin and started pulling down with the flesh firmly gripped. Video ripped her claws against its eyes until blood ran down her fur, keeping the animal from digging its massive paws into Pictures, instead snapping at Video. Pictures yanked his head down, blood dripping down his chest before he released his grip and bounced back, watching with cold eyes as the wolf fell over. The canine groaned and gasped before dropping its head against the cement ground, rocking its paws back and forth as it tried to get back up and failed.
We disabled it for now. Let's go,
Video commanded, and turned on the pad of her paw to run down the walkway where Radio had found Pictures. Radio's heart was pounding heavily against her chest. She wheezed and huffed as she ran with her companions, overjoyed they were all one group again. They made it as far back as the city outskirts, but Video didn't stop until they heard the noise of a cat yowling. She quickly turned and charged towards the sound. It was the coyote from before, snapping at the feline that it had finally cornered in one of the residential alleys. After the cursed wolf, the smaller predator seemed like nothing. Video launched herself at the canine, ripping at its pelt and driving her claws into its flesh. Radio listened as it yelped and howled in pain, only trying to attack Video once before she struck it again with her sharp claws. The animal quickly trekked away from the golden cat cowering in the corner of the alley, running for the terrain outside the outskirts.
Are you all right, ma'am?
Video asked, dusting the dirt from her own pelt with just a sweep of her long tail. Radio wasn't sure if the loudness of Video's tone was concern for the feline, or if she was still riled up by the wolf's attack. Radio's own fur was still bristled. The golden-colored cat got to her feet and looked at the three of them with gratitude.
I am. Thank you.
She came up staring wide-eyed at Pictures.
Pictures? It's really you!
She purred, coming up to the Tom.
What brings you back to the city?
Nothing good, Receiver. This time it's about our government. Pictures shook his head and looked at Video. The ochre-colored feline turned her eyes up to the giant tabby, who spoke firmly.
The capital sent us down here to reclaim some artifacts which were scattered by the mage that attacked the castle a few days ago. Do you know anything about any glittering red fragments being sighted in the area?
Red fragments? Like glass? I think I might actually have something if that's what you're looking for. My colleague and I are scavengers here, but he is injured right now, attacked after he came across a strange shard outside of the city. I didn't think anything of it other than having to leave him in such a condition to carry on with my work. But it could be related. Please, come with me and I'll take you to him. Maybe he can tell you something more.
She nodded to the three, then cautiously prowled out of the alley. Radio watched the feline for a moment, but video and pictures both followed her without question. So she hurried along behind them, guessing they trusted her because of her verification. She had a name given her of technology. Receiver led the three back into the ruined city through a side entrance, once likely a city gate, and towards the towering skyscrapers. She crossed down the wide dark alleys that defined the skeleton of structures fearlessly, leading the three without a moment's hesitation. Radio stared in shock at the rusted beams and decomposing walls that barely held up what had once been beautiful buildings. Gray foxes, possums, and raccoons littered the city even more than they had in the outskirts. Radio felt a shiver down her spine seeing them, as they didn't seem as healthy as the folk of the outskirts either, much as the structures didn't further into the city compared to the outskirts. The entire place was as terrifying as it was described in the history books, if not more so. Radio had imagined she'd be able to picture what the buildings looked like prior to the destruction of the city, but looking at it now, this was not the case. Dust and particles clouded the entire city, desaturating whatever colors the structures once were. The original colors having faded long ago. Even some of the windows and doors were impossible to be reimagined. Nothing but crumbled brick and holes smashed through where they once were. It would be safer to level the whole city, or salvage what could be saved, but the council never put anyone on assignment to do it. Now they were deep into the city, and Radio could no longer see the tops of the buildings. The fur on her tail bristled in fear of the jester still lurking about, possibly cursing another animal upon them in attack. The stoat Faith had spoken so well of the rats who protected her city before they were taken by the vengeful mage, making Radio wonder what the life of the wolf might have been like before the attack. It could have been a poor animal, having come down from the mountains scouting, or perhaps leaving the group it was part of, feeling secluded and helpless like Radio imagined the jester had done with the rats. The canine wasn't even sentient anymore. The individual it had once been was gone. Those words replayed in Radio's mind, and as they did, she held her breath. Whatever might attack them again had nothing to hold them back. That was all this knowledge meant. An attack could come from anywhere in the city, and while they had another set of paws to help, it was likely the mage would have had that in mind as well. Radio looked around, still not seeing any sign of life in the alleys, or along the streets besides small critters.
Then again, the mage can take control of multiple animals.
Radio shuddered, remembering the sight of the group of rats viciously attacking Video as one, and was grateful when Receiver picked up the pace. Radio stared at the feline who had run beside pictures before she sped their progress through the city, and kept her eyes on the road. She found herself biting her lip at the idea of how well they weaved through the city, almost in sync as they led Radio and Video to their objective. She glanced towards pictures when he slowed enough to lag behind Receiver, and took to catch his stare. She hoped that maybe he could elaborate on knowing the sandy-colored tabby, but he followed the feline silently and didn't catch Radio's silent plea. It was hard to believe someone as observant as he didn't notice her looking at him. It seemed like everything he did was on purpose, and Radio supposed he didn't want to share. She looked over at Video, who was on the other side of her ahead. The giant tabby gazed at them both over her shoulder, seeing the exchange, or lack thereof, between the both of them. Radio let out a wheeze before forcing herself to catch up to them. Her paws were already starting to ache and burn from their earlier travels, and having scraped them on the pavement didn't make it any easier either. She bit her lip as her paws pounded over and over against the hard ground, so as to stay in line with her companions. Her chest tightened as she held her breath in attempts not to wheeze with every bound and step, and was wondering how long she could keep up this journey, at the same pace of their courier and surveillance director. Of course, they expected the flighty little noble to be half as capable as the trained travelers. Video made that very clear earlier. Radio was amazed at how well she already had done so far, but Winston growled as one of her raw paw pads scraped against a small but far too sharp rock on the road. She may have done well so far, but she had about reached her limit. There was no telling what this friend of Receiver's would be like. Radio was grateful when the golden tabby slowed her pace and bounded onto the sidewalk. As soon as she could, Radio hopped off of the road and onto the smoother surface of the sidewalk too. She let out a sigh of relief, but then inhaled the scent of blood and backed away as Video and Pictures raced into the alley with the golden tabby. Her stomach turned at the smell, thinking back to the wolf and the rats. Fighting the monsters the jester had created was the only time she had ever had such a strong memory of the scent. The only exception being when she and Pictures were hunting prey. Simply fighting and playing with her sister and servants when she was a kitten led to nothing more than a scraped forehead or slice of the paw pad. A few drops of blood at most. She managed to make it this far and help as much as she already had. She could take a step back from this situation.
Oh, transmitter!
Radio heard Receiver call out, and the young noble's tail flicked with apprehension. Eventually, she looked into the alley where they had run, only to see a raccoon lying on its side, bleeding out onto the rags placed under it. Radio stared in amazement as she heard the raccoon speaking to Receiver and Cat. She eased closer then, trying not to gag at the smell when she came close enough to hear what he was saying.
"Receiver, I'll be fine,"
the raccoon rasped, then lifted up his muzzle.
"Tell me why you're here. You need something."
The light tabby nodded.
Yes. These three are seeking objects much like that shard you told me about. We're thinking you may have seen what they're looking for. Where did you see it? We don't need many details, just anything that can lead us to it.
She touched her paw to the raccoon's face reassuringly. The raccoon blinked at her, then shook his head.
"It's just a moment east of the shattered tower, right before you reach the incline to the sanctified meadows. I'll show you there now."
He broke off in a chatter of pain as he attempted to stand, making Radio startle. Receiver immediately weaved around him and supported him.
Please, don't hurt yourself. You've told us the location and I can take them there myself. Stay here and heal.
The ochre feline murmured as the raccoon rested against her flank. Radio stepped back when Receiver groomed between his ears to clean off the dried blood, while Video and Pictures asked for more details. They asked as though they hadn't even noticed the interaction. Radio hadn't even heard what their question was until the raccoon started to answer again.
Tell us about this object, sir.
Video demanded. The raccoon frowned, then offered,
"It was this glass fragment inside the earth, and it wasn't like anything that could be a part of the shattered tower. It was of a different crystal."
The raccoon patted his feline companion reassuringly when she made a noise of trepidation, and looked up at Video and Pictures.
"It burnt to touch, as though it had been cooking in the sun for hours, and glowed this deep red. I've seen nothing like it before."
Oh, that sounds like our objective. Pictures gave a small arch of his brow at Video. Video's ears flattened as Video looked more intently at the raccoon. The giant tabby's tail lashed in excitement after Picture's words, and she nodded.
That's what we're looking for. Your companion told us you were attacked after finding this fragment. Who did this to you, sir?
She asked. The raccoon hesitated, giving a wince at Receiver's paw pressing down on his shoulder when he tried getting up again.
It was an immense dark canine. His eyes were blue. I had never seen him in these parts before. He barely seemed responsive before suddenly...
We understand. We had a similar encounter.
Video spoke up as the raccoon's words tapered off, and looked to Pictures before he gave her a lift of his chin. Video stared at him and then sighed, looking at the silvery tabby a moment longer, then turned back to the raccoon.
You're not going to live if you stay like this. We need to get you in a stable condition.
What? You don't want to get right to it?
Radio piped up, then clamped her jaw shut when Pictures shot her a firm look. Radio blinked at him, but her eyes rounded when seeing receiver and transmitter turned to look at each other.
They are friends.
Hardly colleagues or business partners. Radio perceived it was beyond friendship. The feline cared for him. Radio's ears flattened as Receiver helped the large animal back down onto the rags and slid up back to Video and Pictures, who seemed unfazed by the connection. Radio frowned when she came up to the three, figuring it must be more common than she thought for cats to interact and involve themselves with others. Despite Pictures' stare, she still pressed.
Shouldn't we head out right away for the shard? We might be able to get there before the sun's light is gone.
Her voice sounded more irritable than she had intended, but it still came out smoothly enough. She didn't continue now that Pictures was on the borderline of glaring at her. Video blinked, looking slightly surprised at Radio, and then back to Pictures and the raccoon.
There's enough time, Miss Radio. I'll be right back. I think what I need is just outside the city, possibly still in the outskirts.
She looked directly at Pictures.
Stay with him and Receiver until I get back. I won't be gone long, but I don't know where those two dogs went.
I'll keep an eye out if anything comes up. Pictures nodded.
So be it.
Radio mumbled as she watched Video leave. Her gaze followed the giant marbled tabby, and then turned back to Pictures, who was walking over to Receiver. Radio's eyes slightly narrowed, but she looked away with a blank expression when Pictures started to turn back to look at her. She wasn't going to be overly blatant about her displeasure toward the situation, but she wasn't going to suggest anything that offered approval of it either. Her gaze fell down to the raccoon, and she watched his shallow breathing for a moment before turning her head toward the rest of the city. All she could see was decaying structures, the sky well hidden behind the dust and buildings surrounding the four. Radio sighed and got as comfortable as she could on the hard ground. She folded her paws under her chest and laid her head down, hoping Video would be back soon. The time spent for this was ridiculous, especially when they had what they needed to find the next shard. What was the bulky cat looking for anyway? The question buzzed in Radio's head. She never thought of Video as compassionate or a worrying type, yet the formidable tabby postponed the mission, all to help a scavenger and her raccoon friend. Radio understood stopping to help Faith. Stoat was a village leader Video had delivered to before, and seemed to know well. Above that, the rats had been guardians of the village, and needed their reputation and memory not to be tarnished by the mage. There was something honorable about what they had done there, but these two were just unlucky. They were verified, but were assigned here, and as scavengers. Pictures may have known them at one time. Receiver, anyway, but their mission wasn't for making stops to help old friends. It was for saving the masses of media. If Video had waited a moment longer instead of acting so impulsively, she might have come to the same conclusion. Radio remained where she was until the large cat was seen in the distance, and then got to her paws. The tabby's jaw was packed with clumps of leaves, and her bag seemed to have moss hanging from it. Pictures and Receiver looked at Video concerned, but the Video strode past them both and hunched over the raccoon pulling away the rags with her paws and dropping a clump of leaves at his.
Eat these. They're plantain and will help you get better. Focus on it while I clean your wounds, if you can.
Video instructed. Pictures cocked his head. What do you know about first aid, Miss Video? Video blinked, and after she ripped up the rest of the leaves and crumpling them, she speculated.
With how you read about Signal's dealings against the mage Phantascope, I would have expected you to know more about my mother's studies in apothecary and herbology.
Video's eyes softened as she continued mixing and crushing the leaves.
I studied with her before I received my title, and learned what I needed to be able to survive by myself as a courier.
Huh. Pictures stared as Video kneaded and smashed the leaves, then nodded, and looked back to Receiver, who was watching Transmitter as he ate. Video stopped mixing and applied the finished poultice to the raccoon's wounds with the tips and pads of her paw.
I've had to use the skills for many others than just myself already, but nothing quite this vicious.
She was surprisingly careful despite her large, long-furred paws, and worked cautiously with the raw skin. Radio looked away when Video groomed the fur and blood off the large gray animal, but looked back when Video started placing the moss around the raccoon's wound, holding the poultice in place and staunching any new blood flow after cleaning out the wounds. It made Radio wonder if Video had been treating her own wounds after she and Pictures retired for sleep, as she had never even noticed the large feline doing so before. But, with further thought, Radio realized she had smelled the scent of the leaves on the long-furred feline before. Once the masked mammal finished eating, Video took the extra moss and leaves from her bag and placed it down beside her. She nodded to the raccoon, then looked to Receiver.
He may need your assistance to continue applying and cleaning the wound, but otherwise, just continue reapplying as needed. He may just make it if it doesn't get infected.
Understood, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Receiver dipped her head gratefully as the raccoon nodded as well. Video's ear flicked, and her tail swept along the raccoon's flank as she moved towards the exit of the alley.
Thank you for telling us what you know, Transmitter. We'll leave you be so you may heal.
Receiver dipped her head gratefully as the raccoon nodded as well.
I'll take them there, Transmitter. Just stay here and rest.
Receiver didn't waste a breath to give Transmitter the time to refuse as she jumped to Video's side. Walking out from the alley quickly with the larger cat, she immediately led the three of them away from the city again, leaving the raccoon sleeping in the comfort of the moss and plantain leaves. Radio winced as her paws hit against the pavement once more when she followed the other woman. And if that wasn't enough, she felt wounded when she heard Pictures chuckle from behind her. She looked at him with a furrowed brow, wondering if he really found amusement from her pain, and had to make herself relax when he gave her a small sympathetic smile. When she still stared at him, he bounded up and let her rest on him as they walked. "It'll be all right, you know. After we get out from the city, the ground will just be the earth, and it'll be a lot easier on your paws." Radio blinked. She sighed and turned to look ahead.
Yeah, probably.
Perhaps she should use some of that plantain poultice for herself too. As for Receiver, he surprised Radio with his next words. She quickly looked up at him with rounded eyes, and he shot her a censoring look before continuing. She, like myself, was not raised by feline parents alone. Even with the shelter and security offered now for the cats all around media, we were born before the city was open to accepting followers. We did not grow up together, and as I went from home to home with many different animals for most of the early sessions of my life, but the similar aspects are still there. I didn't think moving from place to place was going to end for me, until the studio star employed me in Clouder City. But Receiver remained stationed here and stayed close to her roots. Radio's head sank. She had offended Pictures because of her reaction to the cat and raccoon's relationship. Without a doubt now, he saw that she was upset about the two.
And maybe that you were jealous.
Radio swallowed and ignored the taunting voice in her head. She turned her gaze up at the silver tabby, hoping he didn't consider that she was jealous of his relationship with Receiver.
Oh,
She blinked and lowered her head more.
I didn't know.
She hadn't thought of the felines born prior to Studio constructing Clouder City as having hardship. There were so many programs and help in media that made felines a privileged species. Radio was surprised the council still sent cats to the ruined city at all. It seemed strange to even conceptualize the idea of cats born before Clouder City's debut might not be offered the same opportunities. As pictures came and left the ruined city knowing Receiver, yet he returned today, and Receiver was still stationed in the area. It made Radio wonder about the council's actions again, but she blinked away the thought and looked up at pictures as he chuckled again, more lightheartedly, answering, "I know you didn't, Miss Radio." His nose gave a twitch as he went on to explain. "What can I say? I have a bleeding heart for these kinds of things, but nothing in comparison to Receiver. I met Receiver during my first mission in the autumn of last year. While I myself accepted Clouder City's culture and the expectations the studio star set for the rest of media, Receiver kept the values and respect for the other species that her guardians taught her, and never separated herself from them as her people after she earned her title like I did with mine."
All right.
Radio nodded and continued on for a while before she blinked and looked back up at him.
You know, when you say it like that, it seems absolutely unfair, Pictures.
Radio stared at him questioningly. She hadn't thought of Pictures, a surveillance director, out of all of the verified followers of media, would have had such hardship in his youth, let alone feel so strongly about the change brought by the rules and limits of her auntie's city, where he resided. "Oh, by no means, Radio Star," Pictures smiled. "The bloodline of the studio star is what helped successfully colonize this land to become media. Honoring the species would only be reasonable of media's followers. I'm surprised it hadn't happened earlier, if I may be honest with you."
Yeah, I guess.
Radio swallowed, nodding as she leaned further onto him for support, hoping to end the conversation. She really didn't know what to think of what he said. All her life, she had been taught about the goodness her aunt brought to the land by making Clouder City and the greatness brought by their family after the overthrow of magic. But this mage's bitterness and loathing towards her, even after all these generations, and Pictures bringing up the effect the city had on others, made her rethink the matter. Radio always thought of the beneficial action Studio accomplished and managed was the best for media. She never gave a moment to think about the idea of how different it would have been if a bird or a raccoon had helped with the colonization instead. It all really made her think. Why hadn't she ever thought about these things before? She had always been stuck in her room dreaming about the world outside her courtyard. And within a few days, she'd offered to venture out only because of her sister passing up the opportunity. Just the taste of it all in its grotesque detail made her fear being out and learning more after this mission. It seemed like any new knowledge she found out was going to be negative. Was it really the council that was responsible? Or were the people just not grateful for the help they were given? Radio sighed and pressed on, clenching her jaw at the pain in her paws. Then she realized the ground had changed under her, and she could breathe easier again. She let out a breath of relief as she inhaled the burst of fresh air once they were back in the outskirts of the city, this time on the other side. They hadn't been attacked again. That didn't promise they wouldn't be attacked in the outskirts, but they had made it through the city. The bubbliness began flooding back into her with each step, more and more assured they actually made it out of the ruins, and were all still speaking to each other. Radio giggled at the idea of them taking on a giant wolf, speaking to a raccoon, and making it through the ruined city.
What a story. A real story.
Not one she read in her books. Radio saw the Clouder in front of her staring at her in confusion and laughed again, leaping up ahead to exclaim,
We did it!
Pictures laughed. "We're not there yet, Miss Radio." He grinned at her while Video rolled her eyes, but may have made the tiniest smile when shaking her head. Radio chuckled when she saw even Receiver smile before turning back onto the path again. She was having so much fun with them, living through adventure and danger in the middle of this calamity. How could she be negative and judgmental when accomplishing something like this was her dream? She ignored the pain in her paws as she ran beside Video and Pictures, growing more excited as they drew closer to the enormous tower looming at the end of the city outskirts.
But we're getting closer, Pictures. This is so exciting.
She breathed out, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. She could imagine what this building had been, staring in awe of the broken crystal structure, imagining all of the work it took into making the imposing building, which was still standing, majestically enduring the ravages of time and neglect. The shard was just past this, before they reached the incline to the meadows. Radio replayed the words from the raccoon freshly in her head, and made the group quicken their pace to match hers, as she sprinted excitedly towards it. Another shard, another step closer to their goal, and another step closer to getting off of the pavement. She startled when she felt something rest on her shoulder, and quickly looked over to see it was only Receiver's tail to slow her pace. Receiver smiled at her and continued to lead, bringing them away from the giant building and towards the grassy terrain off of the abandoned offices leading to the building. Radio followed on pace with Video and Pictures, and flicked her ears and tail tip once they finally reached actual land once more. The ground was still artificially hard from all of the broken particles and rubble scattered out from the city, but it cleared a little more with every step, becoming easier to walk upon each and every heartbeat. Radio kneaded her paws into the soft earth once they finally reached unadulterated grass, and remained behind as Video and Pictures rushed after Receiver once the fragment's red gleam was visible in the distance. The twilight sky complemented the item's faded red color. Radio then stared in confusion, however, and came up to the three when she did indeed see that the shard was more faded than the other ones had been. Video held it up to the light. It was still unquestionably magic, from what Radio could feel from the shard's faint warmth, but it didn't seem as bright or as powerful as the other ones. Once Video put it in with the other shards, which had begun to fade as well, all three gleamed a bit brighter. Radio felt the sudden warmth through the bag, and was relieved that the shard's power was all connected. She looked up at Video, who stared down at her in Pictures to state firmly,
I think we're running out of time.
The giant cat flattened her ears when Pictures and Radio dipped their heads, gazing down at where they had retrieved the shard. It made Radio wonder how much time they had to find the others. She listened to Video sigh before the marbled tabby turned to Receiver.
Thank you for helping us, ma'am.
Of course, miss. I wish you luck on your mission, and I'm glad I could do what I could.
The ochre tabby tipped her head to the larger feline, blinked slowly to Radio, brushed her side along Pictures, and nuzzled him before she raced away from them towards the giant structures once more. Radio watched her leave in amazement, realizing she had no reason to be jealous of the strong feline, and could wholeheartedly hope she would continue to fare well in the Dark City. She blinked her goodbye and turned to Video. The long-furred feline stayed beyond the slope into the vast meadow that expanded across the entire valley, and lashed her giant tail before tilting her head slightly to look back at both Radio and Pictures. As if on cue, Pictures took a step forward to stand beside the larger cat, and Radio walked to the side of them, staring down into what lay ahead for them if they took this route. She couldn't believe they were really as far as the meadows. Sanctified Meadows was beyond beautiful, seeing it up close. Radio had already been amazed by the Valley of Flowers when seeing it from the castle, but now, only being moments from it, her tail waved in excitement. Pictures turned his chin up towards the sky. Radio followed his gaze to see the monitor device hovering down to report to them. The two behind the speaker didn't bother to greet them before they quickly chattered and mewled.
You did it! We had trouble finding the next shard signal, but located it just beyond the borders of the sanctified meadow. Your best bet would be traveling through it,
Tape exclaimed. Recorder then continued.
You've all done fantastic work. We've sent devices to fend off the jester for now, so don't waste a moment. Be safe and stay strong. We're depending on you.
We won't let you down.
Video murmured. Radio had remained silent at first, and then the words clicked.
Do we really get to travel through Conscience's meadow?
Radio beamed up at Pictures, watching his brow arch. Once she realized it was directed towards her, she frowned, realizing she used the name that Studio taught her as a kitten, and quickly furthered.
My dream was to always see the sanctified meadows, always reading about the council's petitions to remove it. I can't believe we get to go through it. This is just amazing.
We're not here for sightseeing.
Video growled as she sent the surveillance bot away and turned to the two smaller felines.
We're already risking this mission enough by the breaks we've been taking to help these folks, and because that storm passed through. We can't waste any more time. Let's go.
She whipped her head back to the incline and bound up the path without waiting for them. Radio gaped at the feline, wanting to bring up how much time Video wasted by going to find plantain and moss for transmitter. But Pictures let out a hearty laugh, silencing her thoughts.
Are you ready, Miss Radio?
He purred, seeing the excitement in her eyes as she crouched down, as though he were readying to leap.
Like a race.
Radio's heart pounded with excitement, and she giggled as she crouched down only for an instant before projecting her paws off from the ground and leaping into the air. She and Pictures both laughed as they ran down the slope, and Radio only laughed harder when Pictures lost his footing and rolled down the hill before bounding back onto his paws. Radio expected him to stop to catch his breath, but he just raced past her when she sprinted ahead. She squealed and chased after him, having to giggle again, as this time they passed Video, who looked at them both with concern and confusion in regard to their fun and games. Radio hoped she wouldn't mind, as it helped them make progress and made it fun, too. She would likely never get the chance to venture out this far again, proving herself or not, as the three were at least a day's travel from the nearest road now. The ground was plush once they reached the meadow. Radio actually enjoyed when her paws pressed down against the soft leaves and smooth petals of the flowers, and watched them scatter across the valley for almost the entire stretch. She purred as she and Pictures led the way through the various hues of purple, magenta, pink, periwinkle, powder blue, and couldn't believe that there really were every other color in between, too. All of it was even more beautiful in the setting twilight, and Radio couldn't be happier being able to travel through it now. She grinned as she caught up to Pictures and pounded her hind legs into the ground as powerfully as she could to leap right into him, and send them both rolling into the plush bed of flowers. Petals and leaves soared through the air as they both landed in a dip of the meadow. Radio laughed with delight, purring as she penned Pictures down and touched her nose to his temple, as he laughed too. She eased back, staring into his multicolored eyes, beautiful blue ice of his right, and the crisp golden autumn of his left, making Radio smile as she flopped down on top of him, her paws wrapped around his shoulders. Video caught up to them simply by walking, and with a whip of her tail, she knocked Radio off of Pictures to tumble into another patch of flowers. Radio closed her eyes shut as she rolled back into the meadow, but then bounded back onto her feet and hurried after Video.
You have to be excited, Video. I know you're a courier and you've gone all over the place, but this is unbelievable. We're completing the objective, we know where the fourth shard is, and we've already gathered the first three.
Radio beamed and purred, but her smile fell into a frown when Video only continued to push forward, not responding to Radio's words with so much as a tilt of her head.
We can have fun and feel accomplished once the crystal fragments are brought back and when the mage is put to death.
The giant cat's jaw clenched.
Stop playing around like a kitten and focus on what we have ahead of us,
Video said, her last words through gritted teeth, and prowled forward. Radio's ears slowly flattened against her head. She frowned as Pictures came up to her and brushed his tail along her flank in comfort. He gave her a smile and nudged his nose up after Video, and led her forward. She was so amazed by the Tom. He had such a strange balance and intent of things. He didn't even give Video's words and chastisement a thought or concern, just simply took them to heart, even bothering to get them as far as he had, and moved forward. He handled everything as well as he wanted. She sighed with a touch of contentment, her tail whipping upwards in delight, and kept pace with him. The sky was slowly darkening into night, but enough of the light still gleamed from the vast shimmering space to enrich the meadow's colors. Radio stared at it, trying to take it in with every sense she could, so she would remember it forever. She blinked and focused her eyes into taking in every crisp detail of the leaves that were the cushion under the flowers, and inhaled deeply to take in the scent of the flowers and taste the cooling air. She relaxed every bone she could as she leaned against Pictures, feeling his soft, thick fur against every one of the thin, feathery hairs on her shoulder. This was something she would always be able to appreciate, and would take the time to remember for ages to come. Pictures didn't seem to mind their closeness, making Radio relax even more. She walked step by step with him, letting their paws slowly synchronize in movement, and began to purr again. He looked at her over his shoulder, smiling, and touched his nose to her head. She blinked up at him and brightened before she rested her head on his shoulder and continued walking side by side. This was something she could especially get used to, and something she never really had before. Radio inhaled and let her exhaled breath out through the Tom's fur, watching it move without ever ceasing their trek through the field of flowers. She hoped with all her heart they could still stay in contact after this mission. Even Video spoke about celebrating their accomplishments. Maybe after they reached their objective, the council might see how well they worked together, complementing each other's strengths as a unit. Radio watched as another surveillance bot hovered across the area. Same one she saw on the way to the castle. The one they saw before the storm. The one that belonged to Video's father, Signal. Radio's eyes rounded as the camera turned on them, wondering what Signal might think of the situation lying before them, as well as her closeness to the silver Tom beside herself. She didn't bother pulling away from Pictures, knowing the surveillance consultant had already seen her actions, and turned her gaze towards the path ahead that was set by Video, knowing everything was fine at this moment.